All right, welcome to chapter 4, everybody. Today, we are going to talk about nature, nurture, and human diversity. So let's start off with nature. What do we mean by that? Is it nature, is it nurture? Why do people do the things that they do? Nature refers to kind of being born that way, a genetic basis to why people are more aggressive than others, why some people have like a greater desire for friendships and things than others. Part of it could be, well, you were born that way. The genetics that mom and dad contributed through their the sperm, the egg, kind of DNA kind of coming together, and then splitting from there, kind of shuffling up into this kind of random concoction of half mom, half dad that makes you who you are, how tall you are, what shoe size you wear, but also the important things like how much of a need to belong do you have? Do you have a desire for a ton of friends or a few friends, kind of things like that. So whenever we're referring to nature, I want you to think genetics. And genetics are just these units of heredity that make up our chromosomes that mom and dad each contributed on the sperm and egg that made us wonderfully unique. There's a lot of genes that are expressed and other genes that are not expressed that might become triggered by what we choose to eat or what stressful situations we put ourselves in. For instance, think of nature as this kind of genetic predisposition to become this type of person. You are kind of predisposed to grow 6 feet tall, for instance, but if you don't eat enough kind of healthy foods along the way, or food is scarce, you're dealing with food insecurity, for instance, and you're not getting the type of nutrients to reach the maximum ability, then your genetics won't be fully kind of realized. So anyway, why are we the way that we are? It's partly nature, but the other half is also kind of nurture. So nurture, think of environment, which is everything non-genetic. So this could be the type of people in your lives. If you were surrounded by a very loving, supportive family, or a very kind of hateful and distant family, for instance, it's going to change who you are, how you think about the world, what your personality kind of looks like. You might be genetically predisposed to be really extroverted, for instance, but if you live in a really small town where everyone's really far away, that environment, you may not get those same sort of opportunities when you were young to cultivate some of the social skills that make social interactions feel more natural kind of later on. So why are we the way that we are? The other half of the picture is nurture. So the environment shapes us. The number of books, for instance, in your childhood room, for instance, predicts intelligence scores later on in life, partly because like what sort of resources was this person had at their disposal. So in a more extreme view, nurture argues that you can turn anybody into anything that you want. If you want to make someone really smart or make someone a firefighter, through their environment, you could change what they're being rewarded, what they're punished for, the school district that they go to, the TV shows that they watch, the models, exemplars that they see on the news, for instance, are all ways of kind of the environment kind of shaping us into the person that we are today. So, which is more important? It really depends on the trait. Does it depend for like social things, like whether you're going to get divorced in the future, for physical things, like how tall you are, or psychological things like your intelligence quotient or your personality traits? It really depends. In some instances, nature is more important. In some instances, nurture is more important. But to be honest, spoiler alert, it's really a combination of both, nature versus nurture. It's really hard to kind of disentangle the effect of both. So one of the ways that developmental psychologists in particular kind of look at some of these questions are twin studies. What they will do is bring together twins and then look at their relationship satisfaction later on in life, or look at their intelligence scores, or look at their heights, and then they'll see how correlated are they. If one twin is really tall, is the other twin also really tall? If one twin is really short, is the other twin really short? And what they can start doing is saying, well, what is the association between twins when it comes to height or intelligence, for instance? And there are a couple of different types of twins out there: identical twins or fraternal twins. These are often referred to as monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins. So if you haven't taken, a lifespan or a biology course previously, the way that twins can be created, the first way is when mom releases one egg, one sperm from dad fertilizes that egg. So you have one zygote, right? A egg that's fertilized by a sperm. And then during the process of the child kind of growing, developing into the sense of self that it is, starts to fracture. In identical twins, you have that one sperm that fertilized one egg, and then the egg split into two identical versions of itself. This creates identical twins. Another way to have twins is fraternal twins, where mom released more than one egg, right? She, in this case, has two eggs, and each egg was fertilized by a different sperm from dad. So you have two babies being developed, being born at the exact same time, but they are only as genetically similar to each other as you and your older brother or younger sister, for instance, right? Assuming that you have the, same mom, same dad, they share about 50% of the same DNA. Whereas monozygotic or identical twins share 100% of that DNA. And what's so useful about doing these sort of twin studies where you survey a bunch of twins, are you identical, are you fraternal? Then you start looking at what the correlations between their traits look like. And if you find big differences, such that monozygotic twins are much more correlated on things like height than fraternal twins are, then you can be more confident that the reason why they're differing is because the monozygotic share 100% of the same DNA, whereas fraternal or dizygotic twins only share 50% of that same DNA. And the environment is still the same, right? They were presumably kind of raised in the same household, played with the same toys, had the same experiences, went on the same vacations. The environment is kind of held constant, right? It's the same for both of them. The only thing that differs is 100% shared DNA versus 50% shared DNA. And what else do I want to say? In some rough studies, identical twins, when they were kind of placed for adoption, they would be sent to different households. This was more so true in China, where they were facing a lot of pressure to just have one child at a time, and given kind of cultural kind of sexist beliefs of like really valuing having like a male child to carry on the family name and so on. So what would occasionally happen within research is these identical twins who shared 100% of the same DNA lived in different parts of the country, different parents, went to different schools, different experiences. And then what's so interesting about those sort of separated identical twins is you follow back up with them when they're adults. And you say, all right, like, what's your height? What's your IQ score? Are you married? Are you divorced? Do you enjoy your job? Things like that. And then you start looking at, well, if these two people share 100% of the same DNA, the only reason why they might differ could be environment. So it starts kind of telling you environment might be more important for some traits than others. So let's start talking about what some of those traits might be. When it comes to personality, what you find here for like extroversion, which is just a fancy way of saying the extent to which people drive energy from being around other people. What you find is that the correlation, so think of kind of higher numbers here, greater association, like more similarity between the twins. What you find is that a lot of these personality traits, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, open to trying new things, you see far more similarity or stronger correlations between identical twins rather than fraternal twins. So these big gaps kind of suggest that, hey, personality has a strong genetic piece to it. What about behaviors? What we find is that when you start comparing fraternal twins and identical twins divorce rate, what you find is that if one twin is divorced, it's probably that the other twin is going to be divorced as well. But you find the divorce rate being about 45% for identical twins, right? Whereas the divorce rate for fraternal twins is only 30%. Again, suggesting that there might be a genetic component here. to even behavior, like relationship satisfaction, conflict management, handling of stress, communication under stress, all of those sort of things that factor into whether a couple is going to be satisfied with their relationship or end up in divorce. Other abilities like intelligence, what we find here in these twin studies is that identical twins raised together, 100% same DNA, same experience, same environment that they grew up in, we find a really strong, really high correlation between one twin's intelligence score and the other twin's intelligence score, which makes sense, right? They shared 100% the same DNA and the same environment. Notice how it drops off a little bit. Dips a little bit lower for identical twins raised apart. What this seems to suggest is this kind of correlation, now 0.8, is showing that there's, again, like a really strong correlation between one identical twin's intelligence and the other identical twin's intelligence, even if they had different teachers, even if they read different books as a kid, even if they went to different school districts, for instance, which suggests that things like intelligence have a strong genetic piece as well. When it comes to attitudes, again, there's a lot going on here. Well, we can start looking at what sort of variability in blue down here on the bottom is predicted by genetics. And what we find is that some things like political party identification does not possess like a strong genetic kind of piece to it. Instead, what you start finding is a lot of the shared environmental experiences, nurture, taking your kids to rallies and protests, and sitting in the living room, hearing mom and dad talk about politics or watching news on TV, like those sort of nurture or environmental experiences do a much greater job at explaining things like political party identification rather than things like genetics, for instance. And when it comes to physical traits, we find the same thing, right? In white, we have identical twins. In this kind of gray, we have fraternal twins. And what we find is for height, identical twins, there's a lot more kind of shared variability there as compared to fraternal. So physical things like height has a strong genetic piece, right? And we know that. Even going down to psychological disorders like schizophrenia, alcohol, kind of bipolar, we again see these big kind of gaps in the correlations between identical twins and fraternal twins. This means that there's a strong genetic component to things like bipolar and alcoholism and schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, autism, you name it. Notice here, it's not 100. Genetics isn't predicting everything. Instead, it's just predicting quite a bit. So there is a genetic component to a lot of these psychological disorders. And this we will chat a whole lot more about in our final chapter on psychological disorders, where we talk about things like diathesis stress. So what sort of diatheses or genetic predispositions do people have for a psychological disorder triggered with some sort of environmental stressor that causes them to develop it? And what's wild about genetics is if people's kind of personality traits, for instance, have a strong genetic component to it, what you can do is start looking at babies' personalities. Developmental psychologists don't really love to use the term baby personality because they can't talk, they can't walk, they can't interact, they can't really make those sort of like choices that would show us how they really kind of feel. So instead, they use this term kind of temperament instead. Temperament just referring to how kind of emotionally reactive are they? When someone new comes over, are they kind of really easy to get along? This new person kind of pick them up, they warm right up, or are they kind of difficult? Are they like, screaming, crying, pulling away, running behind the couch, not wanting to talk to this person until they leave? Or is it somewhere in the middle where they're kind of cautious at first and then slowly start to warm up to them? What you start finding is this sort of temperament that pre-verbal infants has a genetic component to it as well. So what's wild is if you kind of spin a mobile in front of a kid's face, what you can start doing is start looking at their temperament and predict whether they're going to be introverted or extroverted later on in life. So if you spin a mobile, those little hanging things right in front of a baby's face, some babies are going to like lean forward and spin that thing faster. They're laughing, they're excited, they're smiling, they like want more stimulation from the world. Those kids are going to grow up and be extroverted. Whereas other kids they see the mobile in front of their face and they push away. They're crying, they're screaming, it's too much kind of stimulation for them. Those kids are going to grow up and be introverted. And most kids are somewhere in the middle. They aren't like leaning forward, batting it, but they also aren't pushing away and crying. They're kind of in the middle, just kind of like watching the show, like kind of warming up to it. Those folks are going to be kind of in the middle when it comes to introversion and extroversion later on in life. And in fact, other theories of personality argue that traits like extroversion have to do with what their baseline arousal level is like, which is genetically determined. If those kids are genetically predisposed to be kind of under aroused, there's kind of like, kind of bored. They like need more stimulation from their environment. Those kids are going to like spin the mobile. They're going to seek out more parties when they grow up. They're going to become more extroverted later on in life. Whereas the kids that are more introverted, who already had a high arousal level, are like, whoa, this mobile is too much for me. Putting music on in the background is too much for me. Like, let me study at the library, for instance. Those kids are going to grow up and be introverted. And most folks are in the middle. So why are siblings different? Well, your older siblings, younger siblings than you, presumably, if you have the same parents, are only sharing about 50% of the same genes. And the environment that you guys grow up in can start amplifying those differences in the form of like a self-fulfilling prophecy at times. If your parents see the two kids and one's playing with a ball and one's holding a book, they might start kind of making categorizations of, oh, this is the athletic one and this one's the smart one. And then when it comes to Christmas time, they're buying the athletic one more balls and nets and, things like athletic things to play with. Whereas the more intelligent one, they're buying more books, and they're like rewarding that behavior more. And what you're slowly doing is kind of like taking this minor difference that occurred when they were younger and now start kind of amplifying it over time. So then when they're an adult or in high school, it seems like they're really different people, but that's simply just the effect of the environment on their behavior. It's also important to note that the environment changes with every addition of a family. So the oldest sibling, for instance, was born into a household with younger parents, and they were the only sibling there. Their parents might have been in a different kind of stage of life, different financial situation, different job situation. And then later on, when the second child is born, now that second child that's born is growing up in a family of 4 rather than 3. They have the effect of an older sibling. They have older, more experienced parents that know how to kind of navigate the system a little, slightly more. They might be a little bit older. They might be more financially stable, for instance. They might have learned some lessons the hard way about parenting and potty training and things like that. So even though the parents, like to think that they treated every single kid exactly the same, the environment is different, right? The family is a different environment kind of growing up. And then you sprinkle in like cohort effects. You sprinkle in things like September 11th, for instance, that might have affected one sibling, but not the other. You sprinkle in COVID and a global pandemic, right? Like how is that going to affect one child who is, 2 years old and just starting like preschool versus like a 18-year-old older sibling, for instance, who might already have a car and more established friendships, for instance. So even though they grew up in the same household, their age and their environment kind of functions on them differently, which makes you different than your siblings. So which one is it? Is it nature or nurture? To be honest, it's really a false dichotomy. The answer is both. It's an interaction. And in fact, there's a whole growing field called epigenetics that specifically studies how our environment affects our DNA. So it really gets kind of muddy here in a second. So the environment, is there enough food? Are your parents really stressed? Will affect which aspects of your genetic code become kind of triggered to be expressed. So if you, for instance, live in an area where like food is really scarce and there's not enough to go around, for instance, you might be genetically predisposed to be obese, for instance. But if that environmental experience of like eating a lot of fatty foods, for instance, was never there for you, then that sort of gene might not ever be expressed. So when you grow up and you have kids of your own, you pass on this genetic code that has that sort of like obesity gene kind of turned off, for instance. So your kids and your kids' kids will be less likely to be obese because you were starving when you were younger, for instance. Kind of wild to really think about how really messy it is. There's one quote I really love when it's trying to like understand which one's more important or how do they kind of overact. Think of your genetic code as kind of like writing the outline of your life. The number of chapters are in there, the major themes, like kind of outline of generally the major headings, but things like punctuation and details and gaps and all the paragraphs that kind of fill up that page are all imprinted via your environment. The next thing I want to talk about is evolutionary psychology, which does a nice job of explaining why there's such wonderful diversity in the world. Prior to psychology class, you probably heard about evolutionary theory before. You might have heard about Charles Darwin and things like natural selection and how well creatures kind of adapt to their environment. And you might have even heard of this phrase, survival of the fittest. What Charles Darwin was talking about when he was talking about survival of the fittest, he wasn't talking about who is the most jacked. Like, instead, he was saying like, which creature is the best fit for their environment. And then nature, right, is going to select on those traits of creatures that are really good fits for their environment. And he started to notice this when Charles Darwin was sailing around the Galapagos Islands. What he realized is, each island seemed to have slightly different birds. Some birds had these kind of like real big, kind of short beaks that were like really kind of strong and sharp, really great for cracking nuts. Whereas other birds, not so much. All right, this bird's not cracking a walnut, for instance. Some of the beaks are actually kind of long and kind of skinny. And what they found is that on islands that had like had a lot of nuts, for instance, the birds with like bigger, stronger beaks were a better fit for their environment, right? They could pick up these acorns, stuff like that. They could, crack them open, they could eat. And then they were bigger and stronger and healthier. They were getting enough resources. They could fly faster. Later on, like when they're getting all of that food, they're growing all their feathers out. They look really pretty. So then when it comes to kind of mate selection and the other birds are looking for, hey, who do I want to kind of mate with, partner with, and have little baby chicks with? The ones that seemed really healthy, that were fast, that looked pretty, that had all of those sort of kind of physical tells that this is a good fit for their environment, those birds were picked first. They had access to, to other birds that were just as healthy. They could share more of their food with their offspring. So like their kids had a better chance of survival as compared to these other birds down here that really couldn't crack those eggs. So they weren't as fast. They were more kind of tired, and they didn't have as many feathers, and they weren't as kind of pretty because they weren't able to invest those resources into their own kind of coat because they're kind of starving to death. They aren't getting enough food. So anyway, what you start seeing is this sort of natural selection, where kind of nature is selecting which traits from organisms are going to be more likely to be passed on to their future generations. So if these birds up here are having more chicks, and those chicks are more likely to, to be successful and live long enough to have kids of their own, you start finding more and more of these birds with beaks that better fit their environment. But imagine a different island that didn't have nuts on it, instead had a lot of like worms and bugs that like to hide in those little cracks. Instead, now notice that the selection pressure has flipped. Now the short, stubby, strong beaks aren't really great at like reaching in between like two little rocks or in between the twigs and getting that little bird or little worm. Now this sort of beak is a better fit for that environment. So these birds get more food. These birds are now more energized to fly faster, to have prettier coats, to partner and have more kids and feed their kids better, and like, basically let their kids live long enough to pass on these sort of traits for a long, skinny beak. So what's going on here? You have this sort of adaptive flexibility in how we respond to our environments. And the big things that evolutionary psychologists kind of focus on is, does this trait allow this person to survive and kind of reproduce, kind of passing those traits on to the next generation? And it's not just birds. Charles Darwin, when he was kind of sailing through those Galapagos Islands, he realized, right, the islands that had trees had iguanas that kind of looked like this, right? The kind of classic green. They were small and quick, and they had these kind of long snouts that were really great for like grabbing bugs and things like that. Whereas on other islands that were more recent, kind of like volcanic made, that didn't have the same number of trees, what you started finding is iguanas in the Galapagos like started eating seaweed. So they started spending more time in the water, which isn't really great, right, for a cold-blooded creature. So what you started finding is the iguanas that had like darker skin that sunbathed were better able to kind of warm up and survive longer than more of these kind of green iguanas did. So what you start finding is genetic traits that made the iguanas more green. You started finding genetic traits that added kind of webbing between these Galapagos iguanas kind of fingers. So now it's better able to kind of swim using its tail as a rudder through the water. You even start seeing differences in their face where those noses aren't as long anymore, because now these type of iguanas where there's no trees around are basically eating seaweed off of rocks. So it makes sense to get kind of right there up next to it, for instance. So why is there kind of diversity between these iguanas? The answer, in short, is at different evolutionary pressures, depending on where they live. And the same thing with these different, tortoises. What you can just see on some of the differences of their shells, for instance, is where's their food coming from? What are the predators looking like on their island? What you start finding is these animals, or these Galapagos tortoises that had the shell right above their neck, aren't able to kind of reach up real high. Instead, a lot of their food comes from the ground in front of them. Not a whole lot of predators on this sort of island, or more predators on this sort of island. So it makes sense to have this sort of like protection for their head. On other islands where the food is kind of up there on trees, now notice that we have more of this kind of like saddleback tortoise, more of this kind of saddle where it gives the neck a whole lot more kind of range of motion. So the tortoise can now like reach his head up and reach and grab some of the food off of those trees, making it more vulnerable for predators. But if those predators aren't on this island, then this sort of body style is going to be a good fit for that environment. So that's evolution in general. What about evolutionary psychology, right? Let's talk about people. It still goes back to those same sort of variables of natural selection, fit for your environment. And evolutionary psychologists often refer to, well, what would have helped people survive in the Pleistocene era? Imagine, cavemen kind of living out here, and all of a sudden, like a saber-toothed tiger comes along. Is it a better fit for your environment, right, to survive if you are by yourself or if you're in a group? Well, if you're in a group, for instance, you might have a better chance of like scaring off the saber-toothed tiger or killing it, for instance, or like taking down one of these woolly mammoths and having enough food to eat. You're going to have a hard time by yourself, but in a group, you can do things like that. So what you start seeing is even humans fit in their environment might start favoring people who like to be around other people rather than be by themselves, which explains like why cross-culturally there are some universals out there, like people having a fundamental kind of need to belong, a universal desire for a minimal number of close positive relationships. You and I still today, like we worry about our friends. We value our family. We feel the sort of like pressure and joy of like being around other people. Evolutionary psychologists would argue, well, that's because of pressures going back to our ancestors in the Pleistocene area, where being a part of a group was beneficial. It helped us survive, and it helped us kind of reproduce and take care of our young and get them to an age where they could reproduce and pass on those same sort of values for sociality. Being a part of a group, you might be kind of skeptical of, well, who is this other group? Are they going to take our food? Are they going to kind of kill us for this cave, for these resources? And what you started finding is, from an evolutionary perspective, might explain why prejudice is universal, meaning across the globe, people show in-group favoritism. They like their in-group and they're skeptical, or they derogate the out-group, arguing that prejudice might have an evolutionary basis as well. When it comes to sexuality, like incest avoidance, or like who people are attracted to, for instance, certain kind of like body types, for instance, the like flick of the hair, for instance. Evolutionary psychologists would argue that like a healthy mane, like healthy hair that's not falling out, for instance, would suggest that, hey, whatever this person's doing, they're getting enough food, they're getting enough water, they don't have any sort of parasites and diseases that would cause them to die soon and not be able to help me kind of raise our future children up to an age where they can reproduce and have kids and grandkids and things like that. So you start seeing evolutionary psychologists kind of extending this rationale to argue why gender differences and sexual preferences might pop up. The same thing from a kind of moral perspective. Disgust. This like that's disgusting, right? That universal emotion, wrinkling of the nose. You can just look at someone's face and then instantly know whatever they're doing, whatever they're saying, it's disgusting. We should avoid it. If they eat some food, they find a random woolly mammoth and they eat this old meat and they're like, ugh, disgusting, and they throw up from there. That might cue the rest of the group to like, let's not eat that. Let's avoid, this person, this thing, whatever they're doing, for instance, that is creating disgust. Or if someone isn't being fair, if they are taking but not sharing, for instance, right? You might say like, that's not fair. The reason why we care so much about this kind of moral foundation of fairness is because what happens if people kind of like renege on those promises, if they keep taking and don't give back to the group, ultimately it's going to hurt the entire group, right? You're going to kick that person out. You're really angry, saying you've stole from me too many times, you aren't being fair, you're kicked out of our group. And now this person has to go fend off that saber-toothed tiger by themselves. They're not going to do that. They're going to die. They aren't going to pass those sort of selfish or unfair genes into the kind of gene pool for future generations, leading our ancestors, the one that survived, to value things like fairness. In fact, evolutionary psychologists argue that morality might have these sort of like evolutionary foundations to it, or moral foundations. So there are a few I want to talk about. The first moral foundation is care. Do you care or not that this baby seal is about to get, kind of butchered by this hand, like, by this stick? It's like, yeah, like that's sad. That's terrible. Like, a lot of us have evolved a response to care for things that are cute and vulnerable, like small faces, big eyes, like the teddy bears, like the seals, like babies, because from an evolutionary perspective, when it comes to kind of waking up in the middle of the night and finding enough food and like dealing with like a screaming baby, some of our ancestors were like, nope, I'm not doing this. So they left their kid and the kid doesn't survive. And those genes to not care for the vulnerable, to not care for children, for instance, didn't make their way into the gene pool. Instead, it was only our ancestors that were like, oh, isn't this baby so cute? I'm going to hold it. I'm going to keep it warm. Isn't this baby so cute? When it's crying, I'm going to feed it. I'm going to change its diaper. I'm going to do something to make this baby happy. Those ancestors that showed this moral foundation of care, they're the ones who had kids that actually survived. And then they raised their kids in the same way, kind of creating this sort of evolutionary foundation for care. And what's interesting is, even though all of us have this moral foundation to care, some of us value care more so than others. So we see that kind of playing out when it comes to like animal rights, and don't you care about animals? Don't you care about genocide? Don't you care about pollution? Don't you care about veterans kind of coming back? It's playing on that sort of moral foundation to care for other people besides yourself. The second moral foundation is fairness, which I alluded to previously. Evolutionary psychologists would say that fairness evolved an adaptive response to the challenge of cooperation. Can I trust you? Can we cooperate on this? If I do something nice for you, will you reciprocate and do something nice for me? It's called reciprocal altruism, this sort of like tit for tat idea. And it's really tough. So like we started valuing things like, trust and fairness and kind of cooperation. And we aren't the only creatures that do this. In fact, vampire bats show the same sort of kind of value for cooperation, because every night when these vampire bats go out looking for livestock to kind of suck their blood and feed, basically, they all live in the same kind of nests in these trees. And these vampire bats go out in different directions. Some find food, right? Some might find like a big cow or whatever, so they suck the cow's blood and they come back and they've eaten enough food to survive. Other vampire bats go out in a different direction and they don't find any food. So they're just like one day closer to starving to death. So what happens is these vampire bats will come back to the nest at the end of the night and regurgitate or throw up all of that blood. So every bat that lives together all gets a little bit. So none of them are starving to death. All of them are getting just a little bit of food necessary to survive. And then the next night, all of them kind of leave, find more food. Some find a cow, others don't. And when they come back, some bats might be selfish. They might say, you know what? Yeah, I know you shared your food with me yesterday, but I'm not regurgitating my blood tonight. I'm not regurgitating the food that I found. I'm being selfish. And what happens is that selfish bat is then kicked out of that tree. It doesn't get to live with the others anymore to cooperate and share their resources. So what happens when that selfish bat goes out the next night and doesn't find food, and then the next night doesn't find food, eventually it's going to die alone, right? Because it isn't kind of cooperating. It isn't showing the sort of tit for tat reciprocal altruism with the other bats. The same sort of kind of pressures when it comes to like, can we survive? If I get water for us, will you give me some of the food that you've found, for instance, those berries, for instance? That sort of trust or value of cooperation led to this moral foundation of fairness that all of us still today value, some more so than others. A third moral foundation is loyalty, being loyal to the in-group. When you are that part of that team, that group, that social kind of unit, that you're all going together, you're all protecting each other's kids, you're all warning each other when you see a saber-toothed tiger, you are letting each other know, hey, I saw a babbling brook down there with fresh water, like you should do that too. What happens when someone kind of leaves that group and says, you know what, I'm going to join a different group instead? That threatens the success of that original kind of family, that original group. They have one less person to help find water, to help find food, to help fend off against threats. So what we started valuing is loyalty. Members of the group that kind of stay together through thick and thin. And even today, when we hear like bandwagon fans, for instance, who might get really kind of angry, or people who like turned on their country, right? They were, disloyal, for instance. Even though this is a moral foundation that all of us value loyalty, some of us value it to greater degrees than others. The fourth moral foundation is authority. So evolutionary psychologists argued that this value for authority figures evolved in response to kind of forging relationships that benefits hierarchy. So instead of kind of like constantly fighting amongst the pack, to figure out who eats first, who eats last, we develop more of these kind of social hierarchies. The top dog, the pecking order, right, are allusions to wolves and their social hierarchies, to chickens and their hierarchies. Humans are no different, right? When it comes to farming and like resources and like distributing them, some people are going to be really good at finding water, sewing baskets, creating clothing. Others are going to be really good at defense and finding food. Others are going to be really kind of wise and good at comforting and more kind of spiritual and things like that. And once you start finding this sort of like segmentation of roles, some roles become more valuable to the group than others. And that's a hierarchy. So given this sort of value of like, we're all going to work together, we're going to form these relationships that benefit this social hierarchy. We're going to be constantly fighting and changing roles. We're going to like stay within our lanes and support these kind of social systems, would explain why people have evolved to value authority figures. The problem is some people value authority more so than others. And at times, these systems of hierarchies can be based on inequality that keeps the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, for instance. So it's not surprising that we see differences in the value to which people place on authority. People value authority, but they value it to different degrees. The fifth moral foundation is sanctity. It evolved initially in response to this adaptive challenge of what are we going to eat? It's this sort of omnivore's dilemma, right? So you have herbivores and carnivores, right? You eat plants, you eat meat. Humans are omnivores, or our early ancestors, right? We're omnivores. And we were kind of choosing like, should we eat this meat or not? I mean, I didn't kill it. Who knows how long this like woolly mammoth's been alive? There's some maggots over here. Should I eat it or not? And you have this sort of omnivore's dilemma. Should I eat this food or not? Should I get these berries instead? These berries are red. The ones we normally eat are blue. Are these going to kill me or not? I'm not really sure. I'm hungry. I don't want to starve to death. I also don't want to risk it. It leads to this sort of like dilemma. Do I eat it or not? And there's a sweet spot in there where some people, where it's like, I'm just going to eat everything. Who cares about the maggots? Well, then they get sick, right? They get parasites, pathogens, they die, they vomit. That's not great for survival. Other folks are saying, I'm only going to eat this one thing. I'm not going to venture out and try anything new. Well, what happens is when that only food that you eat is not around, then you starve to death. So there's this, sort of like sweet spot of we want to try new things, but not too much. So it created this sort of pressure to be open to an experience, but also kind of value kind of sanctity and kind of pureness and like avoiding things that are going to make us sick, like contaminated meat, for instance. What's interesting is that even though everybody values these moral foundations, there are individual differences such that some people value each one more so than others. And what you find in politics, conservatives tend to generally value each of the 5 moral foundations pretty high, whereas amongst politically liberal people who gravitate more towards the Democratic Party show especially high value for harm, kind of do no harm to others, and fairness. And they tend to value things like authority and in-group and purity less so, which is interesting, right? When it comes to how people land on different values or how they frame different issues. Is this fair? Is this inequitable? Are there systems in place that are harming some people, like racism and discrimination? It's unfair when it comes to job opportunities and housing opportunities. Those sort of issues really especially resonate with liberal voters, whereas more conservative voters tend to place higher value than liberals do on things like authority and the in-group and purity. So like not engaging in behaviors that like they would deem as like kind of socially disgusting, or valuing authority of God, of like traditional gender roles, of the family, the in-group, kind of things like that. Interesting. So even though evolutionary perspective is really intriguing, it explains why there are kind of universals in human experience, but also these sort of individual differences. I would caution you, beware of overextending these evolutionary explanations. Natural selection doesn't explain everything. So when you're trying to say like, well, why do some people use Facebook more than others? Why do some people, continue to smoke, vape and things like that? Instead of using evolutionary theory and kind of going back to the Pleistocene era, these are more kind of cultural artifacts today that might have more simple explanations for why people would engage in that behavior. Maybe it's more learned, maybe it's more kind of social or culturally relevant, rather than what's going to help this person survive long enough and get enough resources so they can provide for their future families. Next, I want to talk about these kind of cultural influences. So far we talked about evolutionary, what makes a lot of people kind of similar to each other. Cultural differences explain why there's kind of diversity, even in the way that we kind of focus on ourselves versus the group. What we find here in places like America, for instance, we live in an individualistic culture, which just means that we value independence, we value the self. We care about arguments like who's the GOAT, right? Who's the greatest of all time at football or basketball? Who's the MVP award? Who is that one person like making the endorsement saying like, I love this one product, you should follow me. Like that's our celebrity culture. Like we really value individuals. We care about our self-esteem, what brings us pride, like what helps us. So it's more kind of self-focused. Really valuing kind of competition, kind of winner and loser, kind of celebrating the self. Who scored the highest on this exam, for instance? If you were in class in the US, for instance, and the principal came over and said, hey, congratulations, like you scored the best of everyone in this entire high school, it would make you probably feel really good, right? Really proud of your accomplishment. But notice in the rest of the world, all of these kind of red countries over here, they come from more collectivistic cultures. Like in China, for instance, if you were to call that person out and say, hey, individually, you scored better than everyone else in this class, everyone else in this high school, they aren't going to have that boost to their self-esteem. In fact, they might be really kind of self-conscious. Instead, in collectivistic cultures, they value the group, interdependence, shared kind of goals, duty, identity, family, kind of group success, and things like that. So if you wanted to kind of bolster their self-esteem in a collectivistic culture, you would say, hey, your class scored the best of any class in this entire school. In collectivistic cultures, there are like family shaming. So if like one uncle, for instance, gets put in jail because like pedophilia, for instance, the rest of the family might wear the kind of weight of that shame. Other family members might even like commit suicide because like the social shame of what one uncle did. That seems so different, so non-normative for us in the US, because we come from an individualistic perspective where we might say like, well, that wasn't us. That's a crazy uncle. Like, I don't talk to him. I don't relate to him. Like, yeah, we are, genetically related, but I don't talk to him. He doesn't represent me. Like I'm living my own life separate from him. It's just a kind of subtle difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. And I include this picture here because even though we live in an individualistic culture, US, Canada, parts of the United Kingdom, Australia, the vast majority of the world is a collectivistic in nature. Mexico, South America, Africa, Asia, you name it. When it comes to kind of gender development, it's important to note that sex is different than gender. Sex refers to, are you biologically male or female, right? Do you have two X chromosomes, right, making you a female? Do you have an X and a Y chromosome, making you a biological male? Gender is a social construct, right? It's culturally created of what are the physical, social, and behavioral ways of being like a man or being like a woman, for instance. So these sort of masculine or feminine roles are shaped based on where in the world do you live. And they change over time. Comparing our experience to our parents, to our grandparents, to our great-great-grandparents, what it meant to be a man or a woman is different. It's kind of changing over time. And it just shows the kind of culture nature of gender as compared to sex. And gender can even get even more kind of nuanced, such that there are differences in gender roles, right? Like, what do we think it means to be more masculine or feminine? Gender identity, which gender do you identify with, even if it might differ from your biological sense, right? more research on this recently, referring to kind of transgender, kind of changing your gender identity, and also gender expression. What sort of clothes, pronouns, language, like how do you want to express being a man or being a woman? And that might, again, be consistent, cisgender with your biological sex, or it could be different for someone who is transgender, for instance. And there are gender differences that vary by culture as well, right? There are gender differences in men having more testosterone, less estrogen, for instance, vice versa for women, more estrogen, less testosterone. That fluctuates, changes throughout the lifespan as well. There are gender differences in height, such that men on average tend to be taller than women, although there's a lot of individual differences in there, right? Some really tall men, some really short men, and vice versa. There's also gender differences in suicide, such that more men die from suicide every single year than women do. Although more women commit suicide and have suicide ideation every year than men do. There are slight gender differences in personality trait and like neuroticism, emotional stability, kind of like talking about stress and life and what's going right and what's going wrong, for instance. Particularly in the US, we have these kind of strict gender roles for men where it's keep a stiff upper lip. Don't talk about when you're sad. Don't talk about when you're depressed, for instance. And it manifests itself in depression that presents itself as like heart attacks and pressure in the chest. I'm not stressed. I'm just having some tightness here. So men and women will present differently when they experience like heart attacks, for instance, or depression. Unfortunately, women have larger kind of social networks than men. They're more kind of plugged in at church. They're more expressive. Not surprised, they also tend to live longer than men do. And all of that is gender differences that vary by culture. Each culture kind of presents like, what does it mean to be like manly or feminine in your religion, in your personality, in some of these other variables as well, which makes culture incredibly interesting. And last thing I want to talk about for culture, is social learning theory. If gender is a social construct, then kids have to learn what roles, identities, behaviors are associated with being a man versus being a woman. And these change over time. For instance, having more exposure to a more kind of diverse workplace of like both mom and dad go to work. That's been more of a kind of cultural shift, particularly after World War I and World War II. So the ways that some little boys and some little girls learn to identify as more masculine and feminine is learned. They try on these behaviors, right? They, a little boy kind of picks up a Barbie and dad's like, no, let's not play with that. Here's a G.I. Joe instead. Let's play guns. Let's play war. Let's play. And dad starts giving attention when the little boy starts playing with the G.I. Joe and starts ignoring the child or kind of punishing the child when he plays with Barbie, for instance. What you're slowly doing is using rewards and punishment, start steering the child's behavior into more stereotype congruent ways. And unfortunately, the same thing happens with the movies we watch, the books that we read our kids, and so on. Luckily, the US is becoming more androgynous, so valuing both better. So, all right, that is all I have for this week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Take care.